so I can get out there look any way I want to. And that's been disarming at times because I'll have your money and gone before you know it.
For nearly 60 years, the world believed it knew Dolly Parton completely. The wig, the laugh that could fill a stadium, the rhinestones catching every light in the room, the songs that felt less like hits and more like letters from an old friend. She was the kind of star people didn't just admire, they trusted her. She felt permanent, like something that would simply always be there, the way a mountain is always there. But 10 months before the world lost her, something happened that almost nobody paid proper attention to at the time. It wasn't a headline. It wasn't a press release. It was a handful of quiet words from the one person in Dolly's family who had never, in 50 years, learned how to stay silent when something was wrong. Her younger sister, Stella. At the time it looked like nothing. A worried sibling, a little internet panic, a joke that fixed everything. Case closed. Everybody moved on. Except it wasn't nothing. And today we're going back through that entire timeline, piece by piece, moment by moment, to understand what Stella Parton was actually trying to tell the world, and why almost nobody wanted to hear it until it was too late to pretend otherwise. The sister who refused to whisper. To understand why Stella's words mattered so much, you first have to understand who Stella actually was, not Dolly's little sister, which is the only label the world ever really gave her, but a person entirely in her own right, shaped by a childhood that left very little room for anyone to be quiet. She was born on May 4, 1949 in Sevierville, Tennessee, the sixth of 12 children raised by Robert Lee Parton Sr. and Avi Lee Parton. Dolly had arrived 3 years earlier. The house they grew up in was small, money was scarce, and with that many children under one roof, there simply wasn't space for anyone to have secrets, or for anyone to sit quietly in a corner hoping to be noticed. In a family that size, you didn't get heard by waiting patiently for your turn. You got heard by speaking up. And Stella learned that lesson early and she never really unlearned it. By the age of 7, she and Dolly were already appearing together on a local Knoxville television program. 2 years later, she made her radio debut. Before she'd even turned 10, Stella Parton had already been on both television and radio, an almost unthinkable achievement for a child from a family of that size, in that part of Tennessee in the 1950s. Alongside her sisters Willadine and Cassie, she formed a singing group, performing gospel music and recording commercial jingles across East Tennessee. For the Parton family, music was never a distant dream. It was simply what they did, in church, at home, and eventually for whatever money it could bring in. By high school, Stella had started writing her own songs. But life, as it often does, moved faster than her career could keep up. She married Marvin Carroll Rathburn shortly before graduating in 1966 and had a son not long after. For a stretch of years, music stopped being the plan and instead became something she tried to fit around everything else. Motherhood, marriage, the ordinary business of getting by. She came back to it anyway because that was who she was. In 1967 she recorded her first album, a gospel project titled In the Garden, made together with her mother and her sisters Willadine and Cassie. Soon after, she relocated to Washington, D.C., where she began performing at a club called Hillbilly Heaven. It wasn't glamorous work. It was a working singer earning a living in rooms where nobody had come specifically to see her. Then came 1975, the year that should have changed everything for her. Rather than sitting around waiting for a record label to take a chance on an unknown singer with a famous last name, Stella did something bold. She started her own label, Soul Country and Blues Records, and released her debut solo single, I Wanna Hold You in My Dreams Tonight, that September. It was a genuine gamble, built entirely on her own belief in herself. And it worked. The title track climbed into the country top 10, peaking at number 9, and the success was strong enough to earn her a major label deal with Elektra the following year. But if you really want to understand who Stella Parton was underneath all of it, the most revealing thing she recorded that year wasn't the hit at all. It was a lesser-known song called Ode to Olivia. At the time, Olivia Newton-John, an Australian pop singer, was being publicly attacked by parts of the American country music establishment, who argued she had no business winning country music awards. It was an ugly, popular opinion, and almost nobody in Nashville was willing to say a word against it. Stella wrote a song defending her anyway. She was 26 years old. She didn't have a career to speak of yet. She had absolutely nothing to gain and quite a bit to lose by taking the unpopular side of an industry argument, on behalf of a woman she barely knew personally. Nobody asked her to do it. There was no strategic advantage in it. That was simply who Stella Parton was at 26, and it would still be who she was 50 years later at 76, when the stakes would be infinitely higher. The Elektra years were the closest Stella ever came to building a career that stood entirely apart from her sister's shadow. Between 1977 and 1978, she landed 3 top 20 country hits, The Danger of a Stranger, which also crossed over into the UK Top 40, along with Standard Lie No. 1 and 4 Little Letters. She recorded a duet with Karen Taylor. In 1979 she scored another hit with Steady as the Rain, a song written by Dolly herself. She released 3 albums for the label before parting ways with it in 1980. Depending on how you count it, Stella has released somewhere between 17 and 23 albums over the course of her career, and charted more than 24 singles. Those aren't the numbers of a hobbyist coasting on a famous surname. Those are the numbers of a professional who worked steadily and seriously for 5 decades. And she never stayed confined to music either. She took on theater work, touring in New York productions including Best Little Whorehouse in Texas and 7 Brides for 7 Brothers. She appeared on The Dukes of Hazzard. In 1984 she recorded a song for the soundtrack of Rhinestone, the film her sister starred in. Decades later she appeared in Dolly Parton's Coat of Many Colors, the television film based on the family's own childhood, playing a role in the retelling of a story she had actually lived through herself. And through all of it the introduction never changed. Dolly's little sister. For most performers that kind of association would be something to lean on. It opens doors, it fills seats, it hands you an audience before you've earned one. Stella spent 50 years politely declining to use it that way. There's a real difference between resenting a shadow and simply refusing to hide inside one, and Stella made her choice early and never wavered from it. She kept releasing records long after mainstream chart success faded, eventually landing at Raptor Records, continuing to put out work that most people outside her core audience never even heard about. She kept talking too, becoming known for speaking openly about poverty and domestic violence, issues rooted in the world she'd actually come from rather than the one she'd moved into. She was named an honorary ambassador of country music in New Zealand and received similar honors in Kentucky, Louisiana, and Pennsylvania. In 2004, the Christian Country Music Association named her Female Vocalist of the Year. But the reputation that followed Stella around Nashville had far less to do with her awards than with one simple, inconvenient quality: she said things out loud. She spoke about how the industry treated women. She spoke about politics, even when her own fans told her, plainly and repeatedly, that they'd rather she didn't, and she pushed back on them for asking her to be quiet. She put her name behind causes that offered her absolutely nothing in return. Some people found that refreshing. Others found it exhausting. But in 50 years, nobody ever once called it fake. That single distinction is the entire reason the events of October 2025 landed the way they did. When a woman who has never once performed for public approval suddenly starts talking about her sister's health, it means something fundamentally different than it would coming from almost anyone else. Stella was never the family's spokesperson. She was never the one managing the message, softening the edges, protecting the brand. She was simply the one who had never learned how to say nothing. To understand why Stella and her sisters were so uneasy that autumn, we need to rewind a little further, back to March 2025, and to a man almost nobody outside the family ever really saw. Carl Dean was Dolly's husband for close to 60 years. She met him on her very first day in Nashville when she was just 18 years old, standing outside a laundromat. Their marriage became one of the most fiercely protected private lives in American entertainment. He gave no interviews. He walked no red carpets. In a career built almost entirely on visibility, on being seen and known and adored by millions, Carl remained the one part of Dolly's world that stayed completely, stubbornly her own. He died in March 2025 at the age of 82. Dolly was open about what came afterward, though, true to form, she said it lightly, the way she said most difficult things in her life. She had spent years caring for Carl while he was seriously ill, and through all of that time and in the months that followed his death, she admitted she hadn't been looking after herself at all. She said so publicly more than once in her own words. Her attention had simply been somewhere else entirely for a very long time. And grief wasn't finished with the family, not by a long way. Across those same few years, the Partons lost 3 of Dolly's brothers. 12 children raised together in one small house. That isn't an abstract statistic. That is the slow, steady erosion of an entire shared childhood, one person at a time, until the room that once held 12 grows quieter and quieter. Stella carried all of it too, and she spoke about it openly, describing the necessity of laughter and what she called a philosophical approach to a season of life that simply refused to stop taking people from them. She didn't dress it up. She didn't try to turn it into something inspirational for public consumption. She said plainly that it had been hard, because it had been hard. Her own creative work stopped entirely during this stretch. 7 years would eventually pass without a single new song from her, and she later described those years simply and honestly as years of grief and loss. So take a moment to really consider what the situation looked like from inside that family, in the autumn of 2025. A woman in her late 70s who had just lost her husband of nearly 6 decades. A woman who had buried 3 brothers in recent memory. A woman who had spent years as a full-time caregiver and let her own health slide the entire time she did it. A woman who admitted, in her own words, that she had ignored her symptoms because someone else had needed her more urgently. Her sisters weren't spreading a rumor. They weren't exaggerating for attention or sympathy. They were simply describing the person standing right in front of them, every single day. And still, because it was Dolly, because she always found a way to smile and crack a joke and get straight back to work, almost everybody chose to believe the smile instead of the warning underneath it. The first real signal had already come and gone almost unnoticed by most of the public. In late September 2025, Dolly postponed her Las Vegas residency, citing health challenges. Coming from any other artist approaching 80 years old, that alone would have been treated as major worrying news. Coming from Dolly Parton, a woman who had toured relentlessly for 6 decades and canceled almost nothing in her entire career, it should have set off alarm bells immediately. Instead, it was reported once, briefly and quietly set aside by most fans as a minor scheduling issue. Then, in early October, Stella Parton posted a message online asking people to pray for her big sister. That was the entire post. No diagnosis. No specifics. No explanation of what exactly was wrong. Just a younger sister quietly asking for prayers. For almost any other family, a post like that would have vanished harmlessly into the ordinary noise of the internet within a day. But this was Dolly Parton's family. Within hours, the post had been screenshotted, reposted, and rewritten by strangers into something far heavier and more alarming than Stella had ever intended. Headlines appeared across entertainment sites. Fans began writing tributes in comment sections before anyone had confirmed there was actually anything to write a tribute about. The single word everybody was carefully, deliberately avoiding was somehow doing more damage circling the internet than the word itself would have done if someone had simply said it out loud. And then Stella posted as well. This is the moment people would find themselves returning to almost a full year later. Stella addressed those who had expressed genuine concern for her big sister's well-being, and gently pointed them toward what Dolly had already said herself in earlier updates. It was measured. It wasn't dramatic or alarmist. But it was, unmistakably, a second Parton sister publicly acknowledging that the concern circulating online was real, and not simply internet hysteria. For a great many fans, that quiet acknowledgement was somehow worse than the original post had been. One sister asking for prayers can be read as a private moment that accidentally became public. But 2 sisters speaking within days of each other starts to look like something else entirely, something closer to a family bracing itself for what might be coming. The reaction grew large enough and loud enough that Dolly ultimately answered it herself, personally. She recorded a message sitting in a studio in the middle of a commercial shoot for the Grand Ole Opry, and posted the video with a caption that traveled around the entire world in a single afternoon. For words, I ain't dead yet. It was, in a word, perfect. She stated the date out loud on camera so nobody could later claim the footage was old or recycled. She said she wanted to put everyone's minds at ease. She acknowledged, openly, that after her husband passed away, she hadn't taken proper care of herself. She described whatever she was dealing with as, nothing major. She explained that she had canceled some commitments in order to stay close to home and receive treatment, and she asked people to keep praying for her anyway. Then, true to form, she went right back to work. The relief across the internet was enormous, and it was instant. The entire narrative flipped inside a single news cycle. The story was no longer, Dolly Parton is seriously unwell. It became, her sisters frightened everybody over nothing. Stella returned to social media the very next day to soften her earlier message, explaining she hadn't meant to alarm anyone or make things sound more serious than they actually were. She called it nothing more than a younger sister asking for prayers for her older sister, and thanked everyone who had responded with kindness. And that is exactly where the story was left to rest. A misunderstanding, an overprotective family, a star who was fine, who was funny about being fine, and who had proven it herself on camera for the whole world to see. Looking back at that same sequence of events now, something much quieter and more sobering comes into focus. 2 women who had known Dolly her entire life were worried enough to say so publicly, at a moment when nobody outside the immediate family had any particular reason to be. They weren't guessing based on rumors or second-hand information. They were standing far closer to the actual situation than anyone else on Earth. They were, quite simply, the only people who could see it properly from the inside in real time. Everyone else decided they had gotten it wrong. Everyone else, as it turns out, was simply not in the room. What makes the following 12 months so genuinely difficult to look back on now is that the warning signs never actually stopped arriving. They simply kept coming slowly, cheerfully, wrapped in enough good humor and business-as-usual energy that it was always easier to file each one away individually than to add them all up into the bigger picture they were forming. In January 2026, Dolly turned 80. Tennessee marked the milestone by officially declaring January 19th as Dolly Parton Day, with the governor signing a formal proclamation honoring her music, her philanthropy, and her enormous place in the state's history. It was, on its surface, a joyful celebration and a well-deserved one. But it was also, in hindsight, the kind of grand tribute that tends to arrive when a great many people are quietly, perhaps unconsciously, sensing that a story is entering its final chapters. In March 2026, she made her first in-person public appearance of the year, opening Dollywood's 41st season. She looked like herself. She sounded like herself, cracking jokes and working the crowd with the same easy warmth she'd always had. She told fans she'd been busy with a great many things behind the scenes, that she hadn't been touring, that she'd experienced a few little health issues that were being taken care of. She spoke about focusing on healing after losing Carl. At one point, she even joked that the audience shouldn't mistake the park's president for a new boyfriend, making it clear with a laugh that she wasn't seeing anyone romantically. Every single part of that appearance was reassuring on its surface. And every single part of it also quietly contained an admission, if you were listening closely enough. Then May 2026 arrived, and the picture sharpened considerably. Dolly canceled her Caesars Palace residency outright, the same run that had already been pushed once, from December 2025 to September 2026. She explained the decision in a personal video message. She'd always had some trouble with kidney stones, she said, and her immune system and digestive system had been out of balance for a stretch of years. Her doctors were working hard to help rebuild and strengthen both. She hoped to be up to snuff again soon. She mentioned, almost as an aside, that she was still developing her Broadway project, because stopping simply wasn't something Dolly Parton knew how to do, even then. That same month, Stella made an announcement of her own, one that almost nobody connected to the larger story unfolding around her sister. After 7 years away from music, she wrote that she had finally found the focus to create new songs again, describing that long absence plainly as 7 years filled with grief and loss. She said she wanted her new project to carry a message about keeping hope alive, even in difficult times. She wrote about the previous decade in blunt, unsentimental terms. A period, in her words, of losing loved ones while watching the country she loved come apart around her. And when people told her yet again to leave politics out of her music, she refused, exactly as she always had. She was 50 years into a career built on never being told what to say, and she wasn't about to start changing that at 77. She followed the announcement with a new song called Stand By Me. In June, she gave a handful of interviews reflecting on how the family had endured what the last several years had thrown at them, returning again and again to the same two things she always came back to, laughter and a philosophical approach to hardship. Read those interviews today in June's context, and they sound like a woman processing painful memories from the past. Read them now, knowing what came after, and they sound like something else entirely, a woman quietly, almost imperceptibly, bracing herself for what was still ahead. Then in August, only days before the end, Dolly gave one final public update. She told fans she had been through some genuinely hard times with her health, admitting once again that she had ignored her own condition while she'd been focused entirely on caring for Carl. Even so, she said she was still healing. Still working. Still working. That was the phrase everybody held on to, the one that let hope survive a little longer. It was also, in hindsight, the very phrase that made it possible for so many people to believe there was still more time left than there actually was. On Tuesday, August 25, 2026, Dolly Rebecca Parton Dean died peacefully at the Vanderbilt Ingram Cancer Center in Nashville, surrounded by loved ones, after what her family later described as a brief battle with cancer. She was 80 years old. The announcement didn't come first from a publicist or a network press release. It came from her nephew, Brian Seaver, delivered in a video posted directly to her own social media accounts. A message she had personally asked him to record years earlier, long before either of them could truly accept it as something that would one day genuinely need to be shared with the world. Seaver had served as her head of security for more than 20 years, a role his own father had held before him. He called it an honor mixed with pride and with sadness, and said clearly that the sadness belonged to those left behind, not to Dolly herself, that she was, in his words, at peace, reunited with Carl and her parents and the loved ones who had gone before her. He spoke about the door she had opened, not only for him personally, but for an entire extended family who never fully knew how far they could reach until she showed them the way. The family requested a small, private service in place of flowers, and asked instead for donations to Dolly Parton's Imagination Library, the program that has placed free books into the hands of millions of children across the world, one of the quiet, unglamorous legacies that mattered most to her. The message closed with the only line it possibly could have: "She will always love you." And somewhere inside all of it, quietly, is Stella. At the time of writing, she has not released a lengthy public statement of her own. There is a particular kind of silence that comes from a person who has spent 50 years being told, gently or otherwise, that she talks too much. And this is exactly what that silence looks like. Because here is what the timeline actually shows, laid out honestly, start to finish. Last October, two sisters said they were worried. At the time, it sounded like far too much. An overreaction, an unnecessary scare. Dolly made a joke, and the joke was wonderful, genuinely funny and reassuring, and everybody moved on with enormous relief washing over them. The sisters were gently teased online for the trouble they'd stirred up. They were not wrong. They were simply early. That is what Stella ultimately confirmed, without ever needing to write another single word about it. Not a scandal. Not a hidden secret waiting to be exposed. Just the ordinary, unbearable thing that families almost always know before the rest of the world is ready to hear it, that someone they love is running out of time, long before that person is willing to say so out loud. She had been standing close enough to see what was coming. And she said so, the same way she has been saying difficult, unwelcome things since she was 26 years old, defending a stranger nobody else in the industry was willing to defend. For 6 decades, the world knew Dolly Parton as the woman who never seemed to age, never seemed to tire, and never seemed to stop giving things away to people who needed them. Her sisters knew someone else, someone the cameras rarely captured. They knew a woman who had just lost her husband of 60 years. A woman who had buried 3 brothers. A woman who had spent herself down to nothing caring for somebody else, without ever once pausing to properly care for herself. They tried to tell us. Gently at first and then a little more urgently. And we heard a joke instead because the joke was easier, and because none of us wanted the alternative to be true. Who among us honestly did not want to believe it? Were you a fan of Dolly Parton? Share your favorite memory of her in the comments below, and let us know what you think Stella was really trying to tell the world back when almost nobody was ready to listen.